Hello, everyone, and welcome to our October event for One Book, One New Orleans. I see a lot of new names in the registrations tonight. So for those of you who are new to One Book, One New Orleans, let me do a quick introduction. I am Megan Holt. I'm the executive director. And One Book, One New Orleans is exactly what it sounds like. We pick one book. And we encourage everyone in the city to read the same book at the same time, with the idea that we'll grow stronger as a community through a shared reading experience. But when we do that, we have to recognize that approximately 1 in 4 adults here in New Orleans struggles with literacy on some level, either low literacy or access to resources. So if we're going to be One Book, One New Orleans, we have to really make an effort to reach that 1 in 4 that would struggle. So we develop a curriculum around the book, and we get the book and its curriculum free of charge into adult education programs throughout the city. We also get the book into educational programs in prisons, both adult and juvenile prisons. We get the book into the ears of the blind and print handicapped through a partnership with WRBH Reading Radio. And if your barrier to the book would be poverty, we also make sure that every branch of the New Orleans Public Library has some copies so that you can go and get it for free in your neighborhood. And then to bring all of these readers from all of these different walks of life together, we have a series of family-friendly, free programming inspired by our book every year. Sometimes it's virtual, sometimes it's in person. It's always wonderful. And what is that book, you may ask? This year it is, if you don't know, I Feel to Believe by Jarvis DeBerry. It's a collection of 21 years, 1998 to 2019, of his columns for the Times-Picayune. Jarvis wanted to discuss the state of Black journalism in New Orleans and beyond. And so to do that tonight, we have Jarvis, who needs no introduction if you've been following us along. But if you haven't, Jarvis DeBerry is the author of I Feel to Believe. He is currently one of the opinions team at msnbc.com. Welcome, Jarvis. Joining Jarvis DeBerry tonight, we have 3 journalists. I'm going to do this in alphabetical order because that seems most democratic. We have David Thaddeus Baker, who is an award-winning journalist based in New Orleans, Louisiana. He's currently the associate editor of the Louisiana Weekly newspaper and has won numerous press club awards. Welcome, David. Next, we have J.D. Carrere. JD began his career in 2007 in Lafayette, Louisiana with the local news, and then was out in Los Angeles for a while. He came back home and worked with WWL-TV and will soon be launching an independent news source called New Orleans Pulse. Welcome, JD. And last but not least, we have Lottie Joyner, an award-winning journalist with 2 decades of experience, currently working with Verite News, a New Orleans-based nonprofit newsroom focused on producing long-form and in-depth narrative stories on issues in diverse communities. Welcome, Lottie. And because I know that journalists have strong opinions, I am going to go ahead and throw out there, the views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the views of One Book, One New Orleans. And now I'm going to get out the way and let these guys have a conversation.
I feel attacked. I already feel attacked. No, I'm kidding.
That's funny. Thank you so much, Megan, for this opportunity for One Book New Orleans and for everything the organization is doing. I have been excited about all of the programming this year, but this one is near and dear to my heart, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with these fine journalists here about the state of Black journalism in the city of New Orleans, and not just New Orleans, but also beyond. And I think that first, what may be in order first is just to define what we mean when we say Black journalism. And I really wanted to start there because there is a difference, obviously, between a Black journalist and one would say the Black press. I think I'm going to go to David first because I think he can talk about with real clarity here the difference. For example, you have Black people who work for white-owned organizations such as myself, but you might also have white people who work for Black-owned organizations such as the Louisiana Weekly, which David represents. And I just wanted to ask you, David, how you would define kind of the term, Black press, Black media, et cetera. And I hope that you will begin by, because I hope the public knows the history and the legacy of the Louisiana Weekly and why it matters so much to the city and state. But I also want to give you that opportunity to just talk about the Louisiana Weekly in general and how you define and even think about the Black press.
Awesome. Well, I'll give a brief history of the weekly. The Louisiana Weekly started in 1925. It's the oldest existing Black publication in this area. It's not the first that Louisiana has had, or at least a Black-owned publication, but it is the longest surviving now. We started as a way to tell the stories of the Black community here in New Orleans and in the New Orleans region as the demographics of the city began to change and evolve and grow, by which I mean other people of color those populations were starting to grow within the city. We expanded to be able to showcase the stories of those other individual groups. We define the Black media, the Black press, as representing Black people. We are here to tell the stories of our challenges, the stories of our triumphs, to share our entertainment in a way that is sharing it with our community, but without commercializing it and taking advantage of it.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. And David, what is your reach now? What is your, I know you're talking about telling the stories of the Black community. How has that mission changed, if at all, say in the digital era, in the era where print publications are suffering in general across the board? How has the mission, if at all, changed for the weekly?
It actually hasn't. I don't know if this is actually a change, but the way that I do talk about the paper in some regards is that we represent anybody who falls beneath a protected class, primarily Black people, but other groups that are also marginalized. I suppose that would be the greatest change that we've had, but that one came before the advancements of the technologies that we have now.
Yeah.
What I would say about that is that the new technology, social media and things like that have made our reach a bit more expansive. So we have subscribers across continents, across state, obviously. It's a way for people to be able to connect and tell their stories directly to us. We get sources through it sometimes. I would say that that would probably be the biggest change that has been affected by the digital technologies that we now work with. But other than that, the mission remains. We are here to tell the stories of those who are marginalized and to make sure that the voices of the people who don't always get lifted up in mainstream media, as it's politely called, but as you put it earlier, Jarvis, media that's owned primarily by white people and white corporations.
Yeah. I want to introduce Lottie Joyner. And I want, Lottie, you to introduce yourself. You are with Verite News, New Orleans, or Verite New Orleans. And I am going to guess that a lot of people here don't know what Verite is. So I want to give you that opportunity to first say what Verite is and to first tell us, and to secondly, tell us about yourself and what you are doing there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jarvis. Hello to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be on this panel this evening. Verite News New Orleans is a new Black-led nonprofit newsroom. And our focus will be on telling long form, in depth narratives about inequality and about issues that impact diverse communities. Inequality, the wealth gap, health disparities, mass incarceration slash criminal justice system, uh, education, which is really big, but also environmental justice, especially in New Orleans. And so I'm part of the team. We are building the team as we speak. We are brand new, so we are still building our team. We're putting together a group of journalists. We are led by two veteran Times-Picayune journalists, right? Who both won Pulitzer Prizes during their time at the Times-Picayune for their coverage of not only Hurricane Katrina, but also their coverage of environmental justice in New Orleans. So I'm excited to work with this group who are passionate about uplifting the voices of those who are usually marginalized or ignored by mainstream press, right? So we want to center the narratives the narratives and experiences, right, of those who are usually ignored or just left out of mainstream press. We want to uplift their voice. So that's why I'm there, because I'm passionate about that as well. I worked for the Crisis magazine, which is the official publication of the NAACP, for 18 years. And I was editor in chief for 4 years. And so that's part of me talking about not only the African American experience, but the experience of those who usually feel who feel that their stories aren't told, who feel unheard. And so this is just another chapter, a new opportunity in my long career of covering injustice, I would say. Um, and that's what I would have to say about that.
And lastly, JD. JD, as Megan mentioned, started in Lafayette. Now, you're from the New Orleans area. Am I
Yeah,
remembering
born
that
and raised in
correct? So tell us just a little bit about yourself, your arc as a journalist, and the new project that you mentioned that you're planning to launch.
Yeah, for sure. So spending 15 years in the traditional sort of ways that we would traditionally think of telling these stories, working at a company in general, in a traditional media mindset, I found that the audience and the people of my generation and demographics. So having spent the time doing field reporting in Lafayette, going out to LA, working with Lakers and Dodgers and sports, but then getting an opportunity to work, breaking news stuff. I was there the day after Nipsey Hussle was murdered, and as I like to tell people, being on the ground, listening to the other journalists, I believe I was one of the first, on-air TV journalists locally to really understand the moment, and that the conversations that I began to have with people and the tone and tenor of how people receive my reports began to change because of I understood a dynamic of, I want to tell the story from the people side, and not necessarily the, coming from the officials. And so I feel that as I, move back home to New Orleans, and no offense to how anybody is doing things down here, but I do feel that there's a little bit more of a traditionalist mindset in the media of approach, using information from officials and then sourcing, well, then we go on to the community. I like to reverse the dynamic of starting in the community, and then the officials can use whatever other media outlet that they want to get their messaging out. But to me, it's more of a dynamic of giving the people's voice the platform, and then listen, it's not traditional journalism, or how people would call both sides of stories journalism, but I feel like sometimes we don't need to hear both sides of the story. So, just from my arc personally of being in the traditional world, hearing from the voices of the people who stopped engaging in that world, and how do I create a product for them?
Got it. I wanted to do a couple of table setting things right now. And first to say, that New Orleans is actually the site and the city of the first Black newspaper in the entire United States. That was the New Orleans Tribune, which was an abolitionist paper, obviously before the war ended and before the 13th Amendment. I also want to at least make the acknowledgement that the Black media and Black press isn't limited to print publications or even internet publications. And I want to shout out others such as WBOK, but also point out the other Black media organizations that are in New Orleans, including the Tribune and the Data News Weekly. Am I missing any beyond the Louisiana Weekly, the Data News Weekly, and the Tribune?
Okay, I think that's all of them.
Yeah. So I think a good place to start this conversation is somewhere we left off, or maybe at least mentioned in the previous One Book New Orleans event. And if you all were there, or if you watched that event, you may remember me talking about this strange sensation I had as an editorial writer for the Times-Picayune. And again, editorials are not written under bylines. It is like the official voice of the newspaper. And the strange sensation of being a Black man as an editorial writer for a white-owned publication, and knowing that whatever I wrote was going to be assumed as having been written by a white person. And that kind of uneasy kind of feeling, because again, people are going to assume that if they don't see a byline. I want to ask both David and Lottie to talk about what it's like to write the news, opinions, etc., when your audience is assumed to be Black. And how do you think that has affected the way that you have told stories, what language you use, what language you don't use, etc.? Maybe that's just my particular cross to bear when I'm talking about that strange sensation. But I am curious on hearing from the other side. Because as I said before, David, like, you all may have people on staff who are not Black, but if people don't see their faces, they may presume them to be so. And so I'm just curious about the perception of race and the perception of audience, and how that goes about changing or not changing what you do.
So I don't write the editorials for the weekly, but I can tell you that the person who does write them is a Black person. And I can definitely see that there's a difference when the audience is presumed to be Black. The editorials are a lot more unhinged than they would be if they're a lot more unapologetic in the content as it relates to issues that we may be facing as a community. I remember this one time, it was the guy who wrote this editorial this one time was using these very of our community terms and describing a previous mayor. And one of the headlines, if I remember correctly, was, "Ain't that a Mitch?" The response to it was interesting to see the response to an editorial written by a Black person in a Black publication from a white person who then decided to show up to our office to have a discussion about it.
And what was the discussion? I'm curious.
It went in a very, well, he apologized, like, well, there's been a series of editorials about me that y'all have been publishing, blah, blah. And he did, like, it came,
oh, this is from Mitch himself?
Oh, yeah, he showed up.
Okay.
You have, there was one in a series. I think one of them was, "We have 99 problems and the Mitch ain't one." So,
so this is the theme.
Things that were referenced in those editorials were, I mean, all true, but there wasn't this need to hold back or be courteous in them, because it was, well, a reflection of like what we would hear from our audience as they would bring issues to us and say, "Hey, this is really something that's happening in my neighborhood." And of course, we would produce news stories on these issues, but then when it came to the editorials, they were, well, very freely written. So I've noticed that that's the difference between the editorials that are published in our papers and the ones that are published by mainstream, like white publication, or even the Times-Picayune or The Advocate or NOLA.com, whichever name they're going by.
Lottie, what's your experience in writing in a publication where the writer is presumed to be Black, or how the voice changes or doesn't change?
So, as editor-in-chief, I had to write the ed note every month. And there was a certain freedom in writing I believed an audience who understood what I was talking about. I didn't have to explain the Harlem Renaissance. I didn't have to explain Freedom Summer. As some things I felt that my audience already knew, whereas I've done freelance for mainstream media before, where an editor would get back to me and say, well, can you explain this? Or could you go more in depth with this? Whereas at the Crisis, I knew that my audience, I wouldn't have to explain this to them, right? I didn't have to explain certain things about African American culture or African American history or African American art to. But here's the thing, the Crisis is the publication of the NAACP. The NAACP was co-founded by a multiracial organization, both white and Black. And people assume that all members of the NAACP are Black, but that's not true.
It's never been true, as you said.
Right. They have a lot of non-Black members. And I actually had a white member write me and said, thank you so much for this magazine because I am learning about African American history. I have a biracial son, and I use the magazine to teach him about history and teach him about culture. And so, as I said, I felt like a freedom because I didn't have to explain things that I had to explain when I was writing for mainstream. I didn't have to be quote unquote careful also when I was writing for mainstream press. I felt that you could just say, hey, this is the situation. And this is, oh my God, just think about what could be written about today, right now, during this this midterm election right now. Not only around voter suppression, but around some of the candidates who are running. Man.
But to your point about
that, right?
Yeah, but to your point about not explaining things or being asked to explain things, you may remember this, Lottie. You and David and maybe JD remember, I don't remember how many years ago, maybe 20 years ago or so, Trent Lott of Mississippi praised, was it Strom Thurmond, and said that we really should have elected you president back in like 1948. And so there was this is when like Republicans got punished for saying racist stuff, which is a bygone era, obviously. But Trent Lott makes that comment. An uproar ensues, at which point he starts trying to like show all his Black cred, right, and how close he is to Black people, et cetera, et cetera. I think he did an interview on BET and did all these other things to try to make up, right? And so I had a column about that, and I said Emperor Lot is trying to convince us that he really does have his FUBU on, right? And I remember the editor of that said, "Do you want to explain what FUBU is?" I said, "Nope." Like, I'm not going to do it. I'm not, like, all the stuff I've had to look up over the years when I don't understand a reference. Like, if somebody doesn't know what FUBU is in this situation, they're gonna have to look it up. So, but yeah, I knew.
We haven't heard from Trent Lott since, have we?
No, that was kind of like his precipitous downfall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So I want to ask JD, who do you presume that your audience is? You're doing, and first of all, explain, because I don't think we got this.
Mm-hmm.
When you say a multimedia journalist, Like, how are you reaching people? Is it video? Is it podcast? And so that, I think, will help us better understand
For sure.
what you're doing and how you're reaching audiences.
I think for me, when I did leave traditional journalism, there was some very striking statistics about the amount of news people were getting directly from social media, right? And then even more so, the amount of news that people were getting from people who were getting their news from social media, right? And so it's just like this, like, oh wow, this is like this like wild space where people are so misinformed. And so I think that you can look at it and say, well, everybody runs to Instagram, or everybody tries to make a presence on social media. For me, looking at the majority of my work and how sort of I gained a platform was doing Instagram Reels, right? And so, as when everybody was up in arms about the Instagram Reels thing, I was like, no, keep it. It was working for me. And what I was finding is, and just from my back end demographics of looking through my professional, my dashboard, the majority of the people that engage with my content are 35 to 45, right? Like people in my age demographic that feel different, disenfranchised by the news, by mainstream media in general, but they're also not going to read. We're just not a generation of readers so much. So I was like, okay, well, I have done video production and people like my video content. So what if I, instead of trying to take the news and putting it just like on Instagram or on social media in a traditional way, I need to make content specific for the platform, or platform specific content. So, I think of people like Kev on Stage, who grew a massive platform. And he used very interesting methodologies of how to spread. And so some of the same things that we think about with time slots, social media has time slots in the same way that we think about time slots on television. That's more of a popular in these things. So it was important for me to be able to try to become a source of information that people could trust in a space where we see so much of the misinformation and disinformation happening. I wanted to attack that space intentionally, and I think that it's showing good yield.
I wanted to, thank you, JD, for that response. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned it before, your previous answer to a question suggested that you see yourself as much of an activist as a journalist. And I wanted to talk to the three of you about the overlap of activism in the Black press. So Lottie and I are both from Mississippi. I'm actually from the hometown of Ida B. Wells, who was known as much for her activism as her journalism, right? They were not separate and distinct. To crusade against lynching, she used journalism. She and W.B. Du Bois, who the first editor of the Crisis, right?
Yes.
Are co-founders of the NAACP. And so that is both activism and journalism. And the Black press in general, I think David alludes to this, is a form of activism in a way. So I just want each of you, maybe starting with David, to talk about there's this idea that has been widely debated recently, especially with Nicole Hannah-Jones and her conflict with the journalism program at UNC, about what objectivity means, if that should be the true barometer of journalism or not. But I'm curious to know how, as an associate editor at a Black news media publication, you see the role of activism. Should they be separate and distinct from journalism, or should they be seen as one and the same?
I think for the purposes of our mission, they need to be one and the same. A lot of the stories that we do publish, we're getting that straight from the community. So it's important for us to have a relationship with them, and it's important for us to be there and stand there with them. I think it honestly seems just natural to us, or particularly to me. I don't think they need to be separate. I think you can still cover news objectively, but also present the problems and do it in a way that uplifts the community, showcases the issue that they're dealing with, and still engage an audience and motivate them to want to do something to address these issues. I think you're on mute. You're on mute.
I'm going to stop doing that one day. JD, how do you see the role of activism and journalism? Are they separate entities, or do you see them?
Yeah, on my way out of the door, of my last operation, I was told I was too much of an activist to be a journalist. Which to me is, I always like to say that there's, good thing this is why they gave that disclaimer, because of what I'm about to say. There's 32 flavors of N-word, and I just feel like, activist was the one that they decided to use for me that day. But listen, I can't walk outside and not be Black, right? And so therefore I can't be Black, and I can't be a journalist and not be Black. So if I'm dealing with these things, as these things come to me, like any good journalist, we've all been through a pitch process, right? And the stories that the editors and the producers, the ones that pick up, are the ones that you're passionate about. Well, I just so happen to be a Black man who had to go through George Floyd, January 6th, the whole election and all of that. So the things I'm kind of passionate about is all of this, the constant oppression and racism that's being thrown in my face, and then the constant ignoring it by traditional journalism. So, we got John Kennedy out here with the call a crackhead, both sides of the story, whatever it is. It's like, maybe not. Like, we got people rushing the Capitol. Like, well, maybe not. Maybe. So to me, it's just like, if the other side isn't going to play by the rules, if you will, of traditional society, I think that how we need to operate in order to make sure that we still have a society, we got to change the rules a little bit. So, I try to feel it out when I need to be a little bit more activist or a little bit more journalist, but it all gets melded together.
Lottie, what say you?
Yeah. So the movie Till comes out tomorrow nationwide. It's already been shown in some theaters, but it comes out nationwide tomorrow. And I'm not going to insult you about the story of Emmett Till, because everyone on this call and everyone listening knows that story. But Mamie Till went to the Black press. She went to Jet magazine, right? To show the photo of her son and how he was horrifically lynched in Money, Mississippi. The Black press, Jet magazine, that photo helped the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks said that she didn't get up because she was thinking about Emmett Till. So when you think about activism, she didn't give that photo to the New York Times or the Washington Post. It was a Jet photographer. It was in that funeral home, right? She was in Chicago, the Chicago Tribune, right? It was a Jet photographer, the Black press, that snuck in Mississippi, right? They segregated the Black press. If you read Dorothy Gilliam's book, she was the first Black female reporter for the Washington Post. She talked about working for the Black press first and having to sleep in a funeral home to get stories done because she couldn't get a hotel, right? But
Yeah.
the Black press, with what we cover, with how we cover it, we don't even have to say this is activism. Just the face of Emmett Till, that bloated, disfigured face, that was activism. And it spurred a whole civil rights movement that lasted nearly 2 decades. So Mamie Till Mobley was an activist. She used Jet magazine to get her point across. Look at what they did to my son. A Black publication, the Black press. And you talked about Ida B. Wells earlier, right? in her crusade against lynching. Remember the NAACP used to have those flags in New York.
A man was lynched
A man
today.
was lynched today.
Yeah.
A man was, that was a campaign. You know, a man was, so the Black press wrote about lynching because the mainstream press would write a little, if they even cover lynching at all. Most didn't cover lynching, but write something about this big. So, oh, you know, someone died today. You know, Ida B. Wells made sure that those photos were shown. She showed the horrific, you know, what it did. She showed people laughing at people being lynched. She wanted people to understand the inhumanity of it, not just the injustice, but the inhumanity of it. So many people were lynched because they were successful. Black businessmen were lynched because they were successful, right?
Yeah.
And she wanted to show the impact that was having on our community, on our families. That's activism, the Black press, right?
Yeah.
Yes, activism. And so I think a photo is activism. A headline is activism. I totally laughed when David told us about this headline that was in the Louisiana Weekly. I'm like, what? Huh? But there goes that freedom again, right? That's that freedom again. Because we are a community and we understand that and we get that. We're like, yeah, that was a good headline. So when I think about the Black press, I think about, you know, we feel an obligation to inform our community about what's going on in the community. And is there activism? Some may say it's an activism, yes.
Yeah. To the point about Ida B. Wells and for New Orleans audience, I would suggest you check out the difference in the reporting of the Robert Charles massacre from, say, the Daily Picayune and Ida B. Wells. And you will get, I think, a very object lesson in why the Black press matters and why it mattered that much.
If I can pick up on what Lottie was saying, just like an example of how like to just talk about the lasting impact that Black publications and Black journalists have had, honestly, a bit across mainstream now. So I don't think this question would come up in another regard in which, like, a reporter is like an environmental reporter. You're going out talking about what's happening along the coastline, which is important because those things do impact marginalized communities. But I don't think the question would ever come up. So like JD's example of, well, I'm too much of an activist for the outlet for which he works. Would a environmental reporter, because that affects everybody, be asked this very same question? Or would they have to deal with this in their newsroom? Or is it something that's just accepted because everybody has to deal with climate change? So it's just a thought that came to me as you were talking, Lottie, that it's another burden being put on Black journalists and Black publications have to say, like, you guys are doing too much activism in your reporting, when really what we're doing isn't any different than what this environmental reporter is doing. We're just doing it specifically around communities that are being abused. Oh, and there was a question from,
I think, Andrea Shaw.
Okay, to answer your question, and as it relates to the weekly, we have seen an increase in mainstream media wanting to collaborate with our publications. We see some that aren't necessarily mainstream, but are outside of the New Orleans area, wanting to collaborate, wanting to either pick our stories up or have us pick their stories up to expand their reach. A good example of this, honestly, is the partnership that happened between the Times-Picayune and the New York Times. And I can't really say that that was George Floyd related. I mean, one of their editors went to the New York Times, and I think that helped spur that on, but it certainly didn't hurt that this happened with George Floyd. And it's now giving these mainstream outlets better access to these stories in these small communities or in these different demographics that they don't usually reach, to increase their readership. In some regard, I think it's positive for these stories to get as much attention as they can, but I don't know. I have feelings about how that's happening. And it's like, it's a bit of, it seems exploitative to me sometimes.
Got it.
Again, these opinions being shared during this.
Are
None of this
David's
I don't know
opinions.
if there, I don't
the
know if there
opinions
has
of
been,
One Book, One New Orleans.
I don't know if there has been a lot of collaboration, but I do know after the murder of George Floyd that there was money funding resources that the Black press had not seen before. The National NNPA, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, so their members uh, receive, money from big foundations, from big corporations to do in-depth reporting around education or the wealth gap, around technology. Um, I know that some brand new Black-led publications, such as Capital B, because they received a lot of funding uh, to help get started to report on issues of importance to the African American community. And so after George Floyd, you did see money being poured into established Black press, or I'm going to mention the Emancipator as well. You saw money being poured into those publications who were focused on reporting about injustice and social issues. So in terms of mainstream media collaborations, I don't know if I saw a lot of collaborations, but I saw funding given to already established and new publications that were focused on minorities.
I think if there's one thing I'd contribute to this is that I think that there is a level of, you look at like Emmanuel Acho, for instance, right? I think that there's a comfortable level of Black conversation that mainstream media is ready to have, but not the one, like the other conversation, the conversations that I'm having, with some of, like, that's the kind of stuff that I don't think that the mainstream is ready for, right? Because when we think about what mainstream is, it's like the level of comfortability everybody has with this conversation. I listened to Malcolm Gladwell talk about Will and Grace and how that show did more to mainstream the idea of homosexuality than anything else. And I think I don't know if the mainstream will ever get there, right? Because I think that our messaging and my messaging is specifically towards a Black audience for this time. And I don't think that it is for the mainstream, right? And so I think, David, to your point, that there is the exploitative nature tends to be with like the safe Black conversations, which I think are like the conversations that we needed the allies to hear over the, since we're speaking about George Floyd. And so I think that I saw, at least from a reader, more of a willingness to have conversations that were never allowed in the press, but still the activist level conversations that we're having with our audiences, or that I'm having with my audience. I don't think it's for the mainstream.
I think one of you said something before, I don't remember which one, but it is essentially about how, David, when you mentioned, if you were an environmental reporter, that kind of thing, with these questions have come up. And I think one of the flaws of kind of legacy media in general is assuming that something isn't a story if I haven't heard about it, right? Or something doesn't rise to a level if it hasn't affected me. So I had a cousin who was in Baltimore, a freelance journalist, after Freddie Gray died. Or I shouldn't say die, after Freddie Gray was killed by Baltimore police. And she reported from this one like community-wide event. And I don't remember the person who said it in particular, but he said, we all know how Baltimore police do. There's not a person in this room who doesn't know how they do it. And what jumped out at me was that, but it was yet news to like white Baltimoreans, right? So I heard so many people say, "Oh, we know about these riots in Baltimore. They've been doing this for decades. Putting you in the back of a van that's unsecured and just hitting sharp turns as often as they can. I forget what they call it, but there was a street slang for what they were doing. So what I guess the question I'm asking and the comment I'm trying to make is that the Black media don't have to go through that. Oh, well, because white folks don't think that this is an important story, therefore it doesn't get in, which is a market departure from the way that most news organizations work.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's
And
an important.
sorry, I just want to mention the Good Morning America was at Jackson State University last week for its homecoming. I am an alumni of Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. So we were excited, which is an HBCU.
I thought you were going to drop in "The I Love" or something like that. Go ahead.
So I was excited, right, to see my school and to see Good Morning America down in Jackson. But I'm thinking, wait a minute. We all know how great HBCU homecomings are. So this broadcast is to educate or inform their audience, the Good Morning America audience, right? And so now I think they're going to be at FAMU next weekend, either this weekend. So I'm like, wow, Good Morning America are doing HBCU.
But ESPN Game Day is going to be at Jackson State this weekend.
Yeah, right. And so, Deion Sanders obviously has really put HBCUs like, hey, we need to really invest in these schools, invest in these young people. These talented young men have been ignored too long. But without his national presence and his national voice, right, it was a non-story to mainstream press for so long about HBCU homecomings. And, as I said, I got excited. I'm like, what am I getting excited for? I already know about HBCU. But I wasn't the target audience, right? They were trying to inform or educate their audience about HBCU homecomings. And so, Jarvis, to your point about not having to explain, different aspects of a homecoming to our audience, which is the Black press audience, you have to present it in a way to a new audience that's a little cleaner, I would say.
Can I ask a question about that, Lottie? How did you feel about that?
Wait, I gotta jump in. Serious.
Seriously, how did you feel about that?
I was the person who actually found the "Who is SWAC" and put it out there on Twitter first. So that like the "Who is SWAC," like that comment I was like the first one to go through. It was the HBCU. It was like some small HBCU had put it out, like network had put it out there on YouTube, and I went and snatched it and put it up there because kind of to the point, Black Twitter has become its own thing, and I think that Black Twitter sets the tone now on what's culturally cool, and so I think that moment. Me as somebody who understands, I know what the people want to see. I know what the people who follow me. I know what Black Twitter wants to see. Deion going, "Who is SWAC?" Right, and that wound up being the thing.
Well, that's because I'm just wondering, like now that it's not a secret that Black culture is something that has been cannibalized and also commercialized, and the benefits of those things don't always make them to our community. The economic benefits. So to have ESPN go to Jackson State, to go to FAMU, to bring their audiences, I would love to see what those numbers are because I bet most of their viewership is white. That's another way for them to monetize us. But what is Jackson State getting back out of that?
Right, absolutely.
Other than we were on ESPN, great.
No, I definitely believe that Deion Sanders is going to make sure that Jackson State gets something out of it. That's just my personal opinion.
I mean, look, I look at it like this as somebody who's followed college sports and things of that nature. I mean, listen, the ESPN coming to Jackson State as a place is going to help with recruiting. I don't know if it's going to be a 1-for-1, like here's a big check, Jackson State, boom, But I do think the fact that you have an HBCU on College Game Day, that's going to, I think, to Lottie's point, expose people more to the HBCU experience, because not only does College Game, when they come, they don't just come, but they do the features and they go into the community and they you know, people go into the restaurants, you know, and they bring the food up there, and obviously, you know, he's gonna put the big Jackson State head thing on, you know, and then there's gonna be the band, and then so I do think that this is a big moment. However, I will say that Dion being Dion, and then we all know who Dion is that, like, as soon as it's done for Dion, I hope that it's not done for Jackson State.
Yeah,
which is what I'm mainly wondering. Like, how is this going to, in the future, like, continue to produce returns for them? Because Black people have always known about HBCUs.
Yeah, right.
An HBCU, and I know how hard like recruiting has been, so it will help with that. But then there's like we've had to do a lot of reporting on that in terms of like even just like here in Louisiana, when it came to issues of LSU trying to absorb all the HBCUs so they can get that check that comes from the government every year. So just like I'm wondering how, as ESPN continues to see returns on their bottom line, how it's going to in the future benefit Jackson State.
That's
other than like maybe there's a boost in recruiting, which they may or may not have gotten with or without ESPN, but just like what are going to be those returns?
Well, I mean, look,
like for the bottom line for like, you know, dorms, right? Or libraries or buildings with computers, or you know,
and broadcast rights. Broadcast rights is probably the broadcast rights is probably the one thing that if they put on a good show, like a good television product for ESPN, and the viewers absorb it, I think that you could see some level of, you know, I don't think it's ever going to be SEC network level, but a HBCU network type of activation from ESPN in which they all get kind of checked. You know, that when you do that broadcasting, if you do a SWAC kind of a deal, it's everybody in the conference getting that broadcast money. And if we're being honest, that's how LSU and Alabama and all of these, you know, Power 5 conferences have been able to build these. It's because of this TV money, you know, and boosters and things of that nature.
I want to go back for a second to the whole idea of them covering a homecoming and how that's clearly not for the Black audience in itself, right? Lotta, you're new to New Orleans, but years ago, she's deceased now, Deb Cotton was a local journalist who made it a point to cover the city's second line parades. And one of the things she said was, how could this huge cultural event or season of cultural events essentially be happening in the city like Sunday after Sunday after Sunday for about 9 months out of the year, maybe not. I don't know when the second line season ends and begins. It's like nebulous.
It's always second line season.
Yeah, but she said there's no way to defend not covering these parades except racism, right? Like if it's a carnival parade going down St. Charles, or even if it's a St. Patrick's Day parade, right? It's going to be mentioned somewhere. So she made it a point. She covered second line parades as events, right? And I wonder if there is some analog to what the Weekly does or what the Crisis did with Under Your Watch, that, okay, this is something that Black people should expect to see covered, but we can guarantee that nobody else but us is going to cover this. Is there some analog to like the second line phenomenon, David, that, you know, the Weekly is always going to cover this no matter what?
Honestly, Black maternal mortality rates. We try to keep a focus on that, make sure that we are, I mean, that's a couple of stories a year that comes out.
Yeah.
So there's that.
I'm guessing there would be like social organizations.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I said, I'm guessing there would also be like social organizations or social
we
events.
Always cover Zulu, but I mean, TP is always going to cover Zulu now because it's more popular. They didn't always, but
Yeah.
we always have, and we will continue to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can think of smaller, like, I mean, obviously, you know, I haven't been doing independently and have, you know, on a much smaller scale. But look, I think that in the early days of when I started doing what I was doing, I don't think anybody was covering the issues with the administration. I'll try to be as kind as possible. Quite like with the sort of ferociousness.
How nice of you to be as polite as possible. Right?
Wait, what you said?
I said, how nice of you to be as polite as possible.
I'm around company, right? I can run in if I need. No, I'm just kidding. No, but I'll say that you know, when there are issues where we have Black leadership and it's negatively affecting Black people, that's a hard topic to cover, and I don't expect the Times-Picayune or WWL or any of the other local networks to be able to. I never expected them, should I say, to be able to do what I was attempting to do, because I saw what happened the first time that they tried to do it. Things got a little out of hand, if you know what I'm saying. So I think that even, I mean, look, I guess it's still getting out of hand, whatever it may be, but I felt that there was a pass, if you will, that in the minds of some people, because this was coming from somebody from the community, a Black person from the community. Now, it still caught all hellfire from a larger portion of the Black community, but nevertheless, I think that I felt a social responsibility to cover the story with the blinders off. With the blinders, you know, there's the idea of identity politics and not trying to. The thing that Black press typically is there for is to protect the interest of Black people. We've been having this conversation. I was doing things that were not protecting the interest of a group of Black people, but protecting the interest of another group of Black people, in my opinion. I
think that's a good place to go into a question that I had. The politics in criticizing Black leadership or Black whatever that arise in the Black press. There is obviously misapprehension by the greater public that, you know, Black people are some political monolith, you know, and that anybody who ever says that has obviously never been to any group of Black people ever to think that we all agree on anything, right? But there is that idea that, oh, this is the Black side and this is the white side, or this is whatever. How does or how should the Black media cover disputes, arguments, differing opinions, criticism of Black leaders, criticism of Black whatever? How does that? And I'm thinking about, you said the weekly is 1925. David, 1925. Yeah. So it is what, 53 years before there is a Black mayor in New Orleans? Was Dutch 78? Am I remembering that correctly? Was Dutch Morial 78?
He was.
I don't know. It was around that time.
Yeah.
So how does the voice, how does the editorials, how does everything shift or accommodate? Okay, we are defending Black people, but what if this Black leader, for example, is not doing the thing that's most helpful to Black people? It could be a Ray Nagin, it could be I don't know, whomever. But do you do it through like the opinions pages? Is it in the reporting? Like how is that kind of addressed internally without sharing anything proprietary, obviously?
Okay, we honestly don't have an issue with covering the missteps of a Black elected. We do feel like it is core to our mission, because we are here to showcase and protect the interests of the Black community and, again, other marginalized communities. So we do have editorial meetings. That is an opportunity for us to have a sit down in-person conversation with these people about how their term has gone and how they see their term having gone, and then just using the data that we have and just bringing that to them and say, a lot of which comes from them. You said you would do this, but you didn't. And this is
Yeah.
how it has impacted this community you were elected to represent and to make decisions on that would be in their best interest. And because we do endorsements, that's one way in which we can very much communicate. We don't think that you are the best in this position anymore because we're clearly endorsing your opponent.
Yeah.
So that's one way. Covering their successes and challenges journalistically, we do that as objectively as possible. We produce the data, we'll have sources. That's just straight reporting. But then in our editorial coverage, that's where you'll hear out more of our opinion about what we think actually happened,
Yeah.
where we think that you really failed on this.
Yeah. Lolly,
We get
Yeah.
to the office again with
Well, I wanted
the
to
first,
say
I was going
that
to say the first editor of the Crisis certainly wasn't shy about criticizing other Black
he was
leaders.
not shy.
We know your voice was not shy about that. Has that changed at all?
In fact, excuse me, Du Bois, the NAACP had to distance.
Take your time. Like we're in the church.
I'll jump in while she's kind of getting things going. I guess for me, you talked the first thing that you said at one of your meetings was how are we journalists in a post-truth society? And because most of my people come from the internet, it's a lot of post-truth society. And so, I have to like juggle, I have to manage that. And listen, I think that protecting Black interest, I because we're no longer the monolith of Black people, the diaspora has really spread out. And I think as we're starting to see the Gen Z voices come along, the way they think about things, like they don't care about opinions, I think, in the way that we did in journalism. I find that people want to identify with me before they listen to me, right? Like they want to know that like I'm the kind of person that they like, which is a dangerous type of situation, but that's just where we are. And so the responsibility I feel is to the people who have sort of gathered within my space. That is a dangerous, dangerous thing that when we think about how, misinformation is passed, but that's where we reinsert traditional journalism of being responsible and having integrity in your facts, so people can say a lot of things about me, but, being factual or, they could never say that I have my facts mixed up, right? You may not like the way that I only did one side of the story. You may not like the way I used comedy or whatever it is, but factually speaking, nobody could ever call me on that. And as a journalist, right, I see myself being beholden to the facts first, and then we'll see how it lands with Black people. And now as we're sort of growing, I think about somebody like Kanye, right? Like in everything that we're dealing with this,
You actually mentioned that name. Wow.
Oh yeah. It's not all of the whatevers. Yeah, all of that.
Did you see his post earlier, Jarvis? I was as he was saying this, I was just thinking about JD's post and the person who went in the comments and was like, "Do you research?"
So somebody was just like, somebody said something. Do you research on Hitler? I'm like, my God, like I'm not researching Hitler. Like, you know what I'm saying? So like my interest is in protecting intelligence in that moment, and I'm not going to be as journalistically objective in that moment. I'm going to call him an idiot, and we're going to keep it pushing. But that's sort of my style. I'm sort of baking out for myself.
Got it. Let me get to Lottie now that she's
so thank you
back
so
with us.
much for JD for stepping in while I had my coughing fit.
We call that filling in the business.
Thank you guys. So I just wanted to say several things about your point of should we criticize quote unquote leaders as the Black press? That's your question, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or the politics around it.
So when I worked for Emerge magazine, which was an African American news magazine that shut down in the year 2000, so 22 years ago. I don't want to tell my age, but I was very young, okay? And so we were known for putting Clarence Thomas on the cover with a handkerchief around his head.
Was this George Curry still?
George Curry, yeah, that was my boss. And because my editor, George Curry, did not feel that he represented the interests of African Americans. And some people are like, well, this is another African American on the Supreme Court. We should be proud. And he was like, no, he's not following in the steps of Thurgood Marshall, who ordered the infamous Brown versus Board of Education,
Yes.
that tear
Yeah.
down segregation in public schools, right? He said he's not in that same vein. And just because it's an African American does not mean that we have to root for this person. I think it was Jamel Hill who said that Herschel Walker running for Senate in Georgia is a insult to Black people, because you're pitting two African Americans against each other, hoping that Black people would just vote for someone because they are Black, not because of their values, not because of their platform, not because of integrity, but just because they are Black. And so I've seen a lot of editorials around it, especially in The Root and the Griot, about this whole thing around Walker, basically centered around his non-truths.
His lies.
I was trying to be polite. Right? But the whole thing of, okay, let's just put up another African American against Warnock, and
Yeah.
that way Black people will vote for this other African American. It is an insult. And I just think because someone is of the same race, we should not be we should not say, oh, I'm not going to criticize them. Because as you mentioned earlier, we're not a monolith, right?
Yeah.
You have people of differing views, who some people feel may not have the best interest of the overall African American community. That's how George felt about Clarence Thomas. He was like,
Yeah.
he's not for us. And I'm not gonna, just because he's the second Black African American, we're not gonna quote unquote praise him, for this feat. So that's how I feel about that. Thank you, guys.
I wanted to take the time now, since we're talking about this is one of the events for One Book New Orleans, and I feel to believe that I think most people who read the book probably have the most fun reading the Be Real columns. And if you haven't read them, I was going to give just a snippet of one. So Be Real made her first appearance in 2002. No, 2004, I guess. Black leadership has been disconnected. And if you haven't read any of the Be Real columns, the whole conceit is that she's the information lady. I call information and say that I'm looking for a number for Black leadership. And these Black operators start laughing at me. And the operator gives her name as Be Real. Well, that is a direct line from Langston Hughes's Just Simple, right? I'm trying to pay homage to Langston Hughes, who was, many people don't acknowledge him, that as a columnist for the Black press, right? His columns were in Black-owned newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. I shouldn't say et cetera, et cetera. His columns, the Jesse Be Real columns, were syndicated in Black newspapers across the country. And he discussed Black issues. And to the point that we're just discussing, the friction and the conversations that Black people would have with one another about particular issues. If you're not familiar with the conceit, the idea is that Just Be Simple is this everyman figure in Harlem that Langston Hughes meets at the bar, and they're always having a conversation. And Just Simple is the unvarnished, uneducated, unlettered one, but who has a lot more clear and insightful thinking about the racial situation and the racial dynamics than the educated, uptight person who's sitting next to him. But I say that to mention that the Black press has also brought us moments of joy and fun and creativity and excitement. And I don't want to leave the impression that it's all just doom and gloom and listing pathologies and talking about how Black people are, have disparate treatment. Can you all talk about the joy, the excitement, and the happiness that the Black press has helped to communicate, like throughout its decades of existence?
Let me get going. That long pause is communicating to the audience that there is none, but that's not true. So for the weekly, I think a bit of the joy that we do bring is the celebration of just the successes of people in the community, new businesses opening, or being able to showcase. I remember doing a story once on this ballet dancer. I mean, she was like 13, 14 years old, but she was dancing with major international companies. She's from New Orleans. She was trained partly through Nord and NOCA, but like she was dancing with these major companies and adults. She was kind of like a prodigy. So being able to report on those types of things in our community is very uplifting. We don't do as much now in terms of, like, we used to do movie coverage, but that was like pre-Katrina. We don't do that anymore, but we still very much cover our music, the art, our arts here. And that, I think, helps to bring a bit of joy. And as you mentioned, Langston Hughes's syndicated column, I'm fairly certain the Weekly used to publish that back in the day, long before me. I'm super young, everyone. David, I'm a Capricorn. I'm really young. So I think there's also, even beyond what we publish, being able to see our publications in schools. Like the Weekly used to drop a stack of them at Dillard when I was there. It's how I first became interested in actually working for the Louisiana Weekly, when, back in, you're there learning journalism and writing and all of this. And it was like, I think I would like to work here someday. So I think the impacts of that shouldn't be lost when we're having conversations like this. Just the joy of knowing that there is a publication out there that's representing your community, talking about your successes, and not just highlighting the negative aspects of things, whether it's something that's done, like when, I hate to keep calling them out this way because it seems, you know what, I don't think it's unfair. TP back in the day, when they would report on in terms of that community, was like crime or somebody got lynched. Maybe somebody got lynched, and they weren't necessarily using the most positive terms to describe us. So to have that countered with, like, here are some joyful things happening in your community, like publishing a story about the Green Book, which at the time was, the Green Book being able to like let Black people know where you can go safely. But then decades later, reporting on that and seeing like there's a movie about it, I think there's some joy and pride for our community around, like, look how far. I also hate to say, look how far we've come, because, like someone said to me once, it's just so true. We always knew we were people, and we always knew what we deserved. Really, it's look how far white people have come. But but being able to showcase those stories and highlight those things, like you asked earlier about one thing that we will always do, and we will always continue to publish. And it seems like a small thing, but we'll have people who they'll send like a blurb, like a happy birthday to their grandmother who might now be 108 years old. She made it. And I think there's joy for me in seeing that in the paper, knowing that we'll keep doing this. I don't know if other publications are going to do this, because maybe it's not as important to them, but that's an elder in our community. And the people who submit these things are just so excited about it. So yeah, we will go out and do a story on this person.
Yeah.
Those things, I think, bring a bit of joy. And then being able to like have these, again, the other side of that, having people call us up and saying, hey, I'm teaching at this elementary school. Can somebody come out and talk about the importance of Black journalism? Like, could y'all bring some papers so that they can get a sense of what's being covered in their community, so they can have a greater context around how they're being covered, that they are important enough to be covered and exclusively covered, or
Yeah.
as exclusively as we do when we don't cover other brown communities.
Yeah.
So there's joy for us in that.
Yeah, and I was going to point out that when you mentioned covering somebody's success and not covering it as if it were an anomaly, which I
Right.
think is what the Black press does better than their white counterparts. It's like,
Mhm.
ooh, not that this, wow, can you believe this person is a ballet dancer? Wow.
Right.
But like, let's celebrate that
Mhm.
fact and not exoticize it.
I really wanted to read what W.E.B. Du Bois, when he first started the crisis. So, in addition to Pan Africanism and radical arguments against racism, he said, in its pages, meaning the crisis, we're going to be the first to encourage Negro writers and artists, right?
Mm.
So, during the Harlem Renaissance, you saw Langston Hughes in the pages of the crisis. He said, we are going to be the first to have literary contests. We're going to have a section on Negro children. We're going to present Negro artwork. Are you familiar with Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden, right? They did the covers of the Crisis magazine. These
Wow.
great Harlem Renaissance artists did the covers of the Crisis magazine. It says, we are going to feature stories about successful Negroes. We are going to have special numbers devoted to Negro educational achievement. And we're going to have the first articles on consumer cooperation. To me, that sounds like joy, right?
Yeah.
That sounds like joy, celebrating our art, celebrating our culture, celebrating our educational achievement when all of that was ignored in the mainstream press. And most of Black press was created, right? So we could have our own voice, so we could uplift our own. And then, so the crisis was just one organ of that,
Yeah.
in addition to all the Black newspapers.
I was going to point out, David, do you remember the story? Our archivist, former archivist, I shouldn't say our, I'm not the Times-Picayune anymore, but when James Carnes was at the Times-Picayune, he wrote this story about how this all-white spelling bee team from New Orleans went to Cleveland, Ohio, and got defeated by an integrated team with a Black girl on it, and the Black girl was the top speller. I don't know if you remember this story. Right, Eastman was the superintendent of schools in New Orleans there, but so this all white team from New Orleans in the segregated South goes north to Cleveland, Ohio, gets defeated by a Black girl speller, comes back, and they're blaming, oh, well, our students weren't prepared for integration and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the Black people in New Orleans decide to celebrate this fact by hosting a spelling bee. Right. And the white people shut it down and said, we're not going to let this happen. But
Amazing.
I would love to go back and see like how the Weekly reported that particular
What year
event.
was that?
I have to find it, but
I'll see if I can find that in our archives.
yeah,
I'll
but
say-
the Black people say, you know what would be a good idea right now? Let's have a spelling bee.
Look,
So
I'll say
I would
this.
just have loved to see that reporting. But go ahead, JD.
I'll say this of what brings me joy, and I know, depends on where you fall on this issue. You may hate the fact that I did this or love the fact that I did this, but then I'm able to take issues that aren't typically supposed to be for us and find our angle to it. So when I look at like the bike lane story, right, and everything that was going on there, and they were trying to remove these bollards from a portion of a community that's majority Black. So listen, I went down there myself and I was like, let me figure out what the issues are for the people who are directly affected by this, right? We got a lot of people talking on both sides, but who are the people who are directly affected by this? So I went to a city, little community meeting, and I started to hear from residents. And so I just drove down there the next day, and come to find out, you had these like elderly Black people who had like the front portion where they park their cars taken away from them for these bike lanes, and they had to they basically couldn't pull up to their driveway to the curve.
Yeah.
And instantly I knew what the problem was. Like instantly, as soon as I saw the fact that these elderly Black people didn't have access directly to get out to the sidewalk, I was like, Okay, now I see the problem. And I love those moments the most when I can just see it and I'm like, oh, this is a black people problem, right? And the white folks might not quite understand what's going on here. So let's jump into this. So like for me, when I can sort of like decode and like, oh, this is a problem, and you may not understand. And then I get the opportunity to explain to them, like, listen, I don't think you get it, but like every Sunday, you know what I'm saying? We like to have people over to our house and they kind of old and they won't park like right in front of the house,
Yeah.
not in front of the house. And I think that people were like, well, what about the people who are dying on bikes who are black and all that? I'm like, yeah. But what about this 90-year-old woman on a walker, who can't park where she want to park her car, and her husband who has to like now get around into his truck into traffic? That's a problem, right?
Yeah.
And so to be able to tell that story, I always love the moments where I can tell the story from the black side, and again, not really have to worry about how it lands, with everybody else, because it's like there's 7 outlets in the city who's going to tell the other side of that story.
I think we're getting near the end of our time. I wanted to end with this question. Well, we have one more question after this that we have in the comments. I think it's fair to say that I think we all agree that journalism universally is suffering in this country. There's been a marked decline in the number of journalists and a number of journalistic organizations. At the same time, it seems all these organizations are most of the white media organizations, and perhaps it's true for black news organizations too, are having a real time finding black journalists. And I'm curious as to, how can black media survive in this particular environment? When I was editor of the Louisiana Illuminator, and just looking at applications, I remember how few and far between it was when I saw a young black person going into a particular to this particular journalism field. There were some television and broadcast journalists, but I was looking for people who were more writing oriented. I talked to most of the local communications or journalism schools in Southeast Louisiana, and was told that there were very few black people even in those programs. That seems to me to be a crisis. And how do we address that? I know that has to be a concern for you, David. Yeah. I know it has to be a concern for you, Lottie. What is the state of not just black journalism, but black journalists, and how do we go about creating and nurturing and creating a pipeline for that next generation?
Lottie, you want to get started on that?
Journalism is a passion.
Mm-hmm.
It is difficult to find African American journalists. But what I want to say, and I know JD is into social media, is that social media has given everyone an opportunity to have their own platform, mm-hmm. and to gain followers. And I remember when there was a column called Very Smart Brothers. It was just a blog.
Oh, yeah.
Love that blog.
Yeah.
It got picked up by The Root, right? And it got picked up by other publications. But these were 2 young men who had very interesting views that a lot of people wanted to read, right? Yeah. These were not traditional journalists, right? These were not 2 people who had gone to journalism school, either at HBCU or Northwestern, or these were 2 people who were like, yo, this is how I feel about this issue. And they gained their own following, and they were picked up by media, right?
Yeah.
And so I believe a lot of people see the technology of today as an opportunity to have your own platform. And if I can have a blog that takes off and I'm getting advertising and I'm becoming an influencer,
Yeah.
I go to this newspaper and start off making 15, 20, 30,000 a year. And, I can barely pay my rent and, right. And so I think, as journalists, uh, we are going to have to be creative in helping people create their own platforms, but also providing the information and about just basic journalism. One of a famous blogger influencer just got sued by Cardi B because she's spewing out wrong information. Right? She's not a traditional journalist. Now she owed Cardi B millions because she felt that she had the right to say wrong information, right? So in teaching people about ethics, right? In teaching people of, just about basic journalism and, okay, I have a YouTube channel. I'm going to just say this. And some people have gotten in trouble about that. And so I think we have an opportunity here, right? To work with those who are interested in journalism, but do not see traditional journalism as the way to go. So that's my thoughts on it.
David, what's your experience been?
I mean,
I completely agree with that.
Sorry.
What did you say, JD? Oh, I completely agree with what Lottie said. It's a challenge. This emerging generation is very, very different. I even noticed when we had some interns a few years ago who were in journalism programs, the way journalism is taught now is different. It's a lot of the programs that we were dealing with through some of these HBCUs are now called mixed media arts. And the interns I got weren't accustomed to doing long form journalism, even short form in a way. Yeah, because it was, they were here for a few months and I had to walk them through a lot of that. And this is how you do this, which was honestly taking a lot more time for me. But I think something like this needs to start before kids go to college. I think a resurgence of high school newspapers and really having these high schools maybe partner up with traditional media to have people go into those classrooms on certain days and just mentor.
Yeah.
Really spark that interest and get them started early on journalistic ethics. And if they want to later on go on to be some form of an influencer, which as Lottie pointed out so aptly, that is a huge reason why people now are just well, I don't need to go to J school. I can just, I have an Instagram account and I have 15,000 followers already.
Yeah.
But not understanding the dynamics of what goes into a good news story just because you had one story up that people were interested in is, it's a challenge. But I think starting at the high school level, interesting kids and then walking them through or getting them to the point where you apply to college, you're going to journalism track. So even so I don't know if anyone knows this. So I'm currently the head of the press club of New Orleans. We give out a scholarship every year. And honestly, it is becoming more and more of a struggle to find kids to give this money to because a lot of them are going into public relations and that is a part of our membership. They're eligible for these scholarships just as long as you're in a journalism program. But we're not seeing a lot of students who are actually going the journalism route. And I think I really think it does have a lot to do with the fact that you can start your own YouTube channel, become an influencer, and just take off from there.
Yeah, it's really no gatekeeping to become prominent.
Right.
Well, yeah. I'm gonna push back a little bit because there's no gatekeeping to become prominent to an audience, right? Mm-hmm. But there is gatekeeping, no offense, to become prominent to to a press club, right? Because when we think about impact, no matter how great my storytelling is, right? I don't have call letters. I don't have a whatever. As you know, I don't have any of these things. So for me, I think that one of the reasons why people of my generation have been so disillusioned by media is because that I feel like the target audience is always people who read newspapers and watch television at 5, 6, and 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about the new age generation of Black people, they don't want that. Like, they don't necessarily want to read a article and how the Associated Press and all of their sort of Eurocentric mindsets have decided that print needs to be, you know, or the 1 minute 30 news package that gives absolutely no context. I don't think that people want to create that way because there's more freedom in creation, that I don't have to stick to that methodology, and journalism tells me I have to. And so that's why I find myself sort of in this middle space, is because I've spent 15 years being traditionally trained, right? But my methodology and the audience that I wanted to deliver a message to didn't want to watch me at 5, 6, and 10. And they also don't want to watch the version of my news package on Instagram. And they're definitely not reading. And so I think that because I think that with the technological because of technology, we have created 2 completely different societies, right? When it comes to information gathering. So, you're jamming. So for me, it's more about, again, defining traditional journalism. To me, feels like such a constricting space for the messaging that I need to get out to this demographic of people. So I think the future of journalism, we have to come to a middle ground. Like, this idea of what is journalism, we have to evolve that, I guess, block of, like, I can't even, no matter how great my work is, I can't submit it to Suncoast. You know what I'm saying? Like, because I'm just on Instagram. So I think that we really have to rethink, I think, because it's a respect thing, I think, for this generation of people. They are where they are. They're not coming to you anymore. And so because we have to go to them, we have to go to their Instagram. We have to go to their TikTok. Like, if we want them, if we want everybody else who already thinks how they've been thinking, that's one thing. But this new generation of taxpayers, of homeowners, and, voters, specifically voters, when we think about this midterm, I knew how important this midterm was, and I knew that they weren't going to watch me on TV, right? And so I had to do what I had to do to get this information out to people. So I think the future of Black journalism, specifically because we've always been able to do things differently, I think about, like, the Black Information Network. I'm like, okay, cool. It sounds just like them, but with Black people, right? And so it's what's the difference? So I think, like, I want to, Black people are hip hop, Black people are breakdancing, like, we've always jazz music. All of these things have always broke away from tradition, and that's how we've been able to elevate. And I think that Black journalism still lives in that world of, like, we have to be traditional journalists, so if we want to be respected, I'm like, I guess,
But I think I don't want to overlook the fact that you mentioned the training that you've had, right?
Yeah.
And so you've mentioned the training. I think our issue is people who don't want to be trained at all, and who, as Lolly mentioned,
well, here's the thing,
end up getting a how many $1 million defamatory suit from Cardi B when a simple like, you can't say this if you don't. When a simple, you cannot say this without facts, would have saved her. Right?
Yeah, but it took dedicated news directors and managers and producers and all of these other people, because I didn't go to journalism school per se. Like, I started as a floor camera operator. Right?
I didn't go to journalism school, so that's never been the route. And I think to wrap this up, perhaps, it's never been really the route. Journalism has always been more of an apprenticeship program than some type of academic study, right? nobody coming out of school like is quote unquote a journalist. You become a journalist when you start doing journalism. That's the only time that you can actually call yourself that. And so I wasn't trained as a journalist. I went to school and majored in English Lit, but I worked at newspapers. I worked at my hometown newspaper. I worked at the college paper. I got an internship with the Post-Dispatch, got an internship with the Times-Picayune. And so, and perhaps that's what these young people that we're talking about and discussing not coming in journalism need to be taught. You don't have to major in journalism to become a journalist. You don't have to major in mass comm to become a journalist. None of the people, not a single person who hired me at the Times-Picayune had actually majored in journalism. Mm-hmm. And so that's not necessarily a thing that even has to be. But I think we were all, I won't speak for them, but I will stand firm on the fact that there are some things that you got to know how to do, things to protect yourself, things to protect, and you can't just go out there, you know, and go rogue and
like
expect
I said,
to be,
pop off, but I got my facts.
But some people pop off without the facts, and I think that's our problem. We have been here 90 minutes. I think it's time to wrap it up, but I do really want to shout out all three journalists who are on this panel tonight. Please read and subscribe to the Louisiana Weekly. It's a reliable source of information. I love their commentary page. I've always loved their commentary page.
Thank you.
And please, before you log off tonight, see if you might consider supporting Louisiana Weekly. Verite is new, but they're growing. They made a great hire with Lottie. JD is doing his thing. I just wanted to give each of you an opportunity just to sign off and maybe a closing comment. Or did I do it already?
I just wanted to thank, first of all, I want to thank Megan for reaching out and inviting me to be a panelist. Thank you, Jarvis, for you're a great moderator, and I've enjoyed chatting it up with David and JD. I can look forward to meeting all of you in person when I get to New Orleans. We could chat it up some more. So I look forward to meeting all of you in person. I want you to check out Verite News New Orleans, and I just really enjoyed being part of this panel and being part of this conversation. Is an important conversation. And so thank you, Jarvis. Thank you to my other panelists, JD and David, and thank you, Megan.
It means a lot to be on the panel with all of you, with your years. Listen, I have the utmost respect for people fighting the good fight on the inside. So thank you, Jarvis. Obviously, you've been a role model of mine. I told you that before. And David and Lottie, thank you all. Megan and Liz, you're my homegirl. I have been enjoying this read very much. Thank you, sir. I definitely love the piece about the, dancing in the New Orleans. I feel like that one needs an update because I feel like it's like, I feel like you can tell that exact same story today and probably nothing would change. So thank you all, and thank you for everybody for being there.
Yeah. Again, echo everything they just said. Thanks, Jarvis, for moderating. Megan, Liz, thank you for inviting me. I love an opportunity to talk about the weekly, talk about Black press and the importance of it for our community. And that, honestly, not even just our community. Lottie, I look forward to your move to New Orleans. Let's get lunch when you get here. And thank you to the audience. I don't know why I got louder when I said that, like I'm shouting in an auditorium. Thank y'all for tuning in. It's been a great discussion. And I hope to do it again. This has honestly come full circle for me with One Book. About 10 years ago, I was a project leader for One Book, One New Orleans. So yeah, I'm always happy to do kind of almost anything when they call and ask me.
I'm so glad you were here, David. So glad to see all of you. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much for coming on, for being a part of the panel. And I absolutely agree. A lot of the columns, and I feel to believe, you read them and they were written 10 years ago, but they feel like they could have happened yesterday. So it's really wild to see these things just keep moving through time. And I encourage everyone to read the book, one of the columns you'll see, I believe it's the third to the last, Jarvis, is why doesn't Louisiana have a civil rights museum? And that has been a huge discussion. It was in our first ever One Book event that was virtual. People kept talking about that column. So on November 19th, you can look forward to a one-night discussion of Louisiana's contributions to the civil rights movement. That will be in person at 6 p.m. at the TEP Center. We are going to discuss the history and the place it was made. We're really excited about that. So mark your calendars and come out and join us on November 19th. And then last but not least, we're going to read the writings of adult learners in our community who've been using Jarvis's book to improve their literacy skills. And they've written their own news stories. I'm reading some of them right now. They're incredibly moving. I can't wait for everyone to see them when we launch the book Local News on December 8th. Be looking for a location on that. That will hopefully be in person if gods are willing and the creek don't rise. So thank you so much for everyone for coming out. Look forward to seeing you again in November and December. And have a wonderful day. Read something good. Bye.